Next, from Springfield, Illinois Channel board member Katie Lawrence interviews her father, the longtime newsman Mike Lawrence, who's covered politics for nearly 50 years. Mike Lawrence also served as press secretary to Governor Jim Edgar and worked with the late Senator Paul Simon. We hear Mr. Lawrence's thoughts on the changing nature of journalism in the era of the internet and social media. This runs about 35 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mike, for being here today. And as an Illinois Channel board member, I am certainly delighted that I am the one that gets to do this interview. I think I should tell the viewers up front that it's a rare opportunity I think that many would enjoy, that you're my dad. So thank you for taking the time to discuss journalism yesterday and today with me for the Illinois Channel viewers. And I guess we can go ahead and start with your first newspaper. You were your own publisher at age 11. Would you care to embellish on that for us?
Sure. After I decided that I didn't want to be a cowboy, I entertained the notion of actually becoming a pro athlete. We loved sports in our neighborhood. There were a lot of boys. We were out there almost every day. Well, I decided at the ripe old age of 11 that I was not going to make it as a pro athlete. I began reading sports pages when I was 5 or 6 years old. A neighbor kid taught me to read, actually, at about 4. So I had been reading sports pages, and I decided I'd give a shot at sports writing, which then would keep me around sports without having to have the skills to really make it as a professional. So I started a paper which, strangely enough, was called the Lawrence Weekly, and I had about 20 subscribers, members of course, the immediate family, and then I had aunts and uncles and a few neighbors, and I actually used to type the paper myself. And we didn't even have a mimeograph machine at home, so I used carbon paper. And so with a circulation of about 20 readers, I had to type each page of my paper about 6 or 7 times.
That's a lot of work.
But it's, it's been downhill ever since.
Right,
I had my own paper and...
Your own boss.
That's right, yeah.
And it's interesting that, it wasn't maybe a journalism aspect of it that was your influence that got you into writing. It was more on the love of sports. And I understand, that when you want to be something around that you love, you find a different avenue to find that. So I love that story. I tell it quite often. And moving on to that, the love of sports writing, clearly you went into more of the investigative side later in your career, even though you were still a very young person and quite accomplished in terms of investigative reporting. Maybe we can kind of talk a little bit about time in Iowa when you were with the Quad City Times. And I know for a fact, I remember going to the newsroom as a kid to visit, and just that sense, the smell, the atmosphere, and just the excitement surrounding a newspaper room back then. I don't know if that aspect is still there now, and we can kind of get to that later, but talk about, the nitty-gritty and the timing, and to put a story to bed, and sources. This is before cell phones, this is before the internet. And I think that, it's such a classic example of how journalism has changed so much in today's area of social media. And if you can kind of go on that for a little bit and talk about, how a story was really, from start to finish in the quote-unquote old days when it was just real journalism, as far as I'm concerned, as a definition.
Well, the newsroom was a far different atmosphere then than now. You're right on that. First of all, you could smoke.
Right.
And most of us smoked. We had typewriters. They made noise. We had teletype machines. They made noise. It added, I think, to the excitement of the newsroom. Today, newsrooms are a lot quieter. As far as reporting was concerned, the key from the get-go was to develop sources. And I felt that I did a pretty good job of that. I had a lot of sources. One of the things I learned early on when I had a slow moment in the newsroom, I would just start calling people and asking them what's new or what's going on. And many times the person I was calling thought I knew something about what had happened to that individual or around that individual, and that's why I was really calling. And so I'd make a call, and all of a sudden a source would be telling about me about something that I really didn't know about. It's changed a lot. We had deadlines, of course, then, and we did not have word processors. As I said, there were typewriters. So one of my strong memories is when Bobby Kennedy came to the Quad Cities. I was working for the Times Democrat, which is now the Quad City Times. We probably should get that into this conversation. But Bobby Kennedy came in, and I covered him when he was there. He was running for president, 1968, and this would have been shortly before he was assassinated. But we were right on deadline, so I got back to the newsroom, I started typing, and literally I'd write 3 paragraphs and the managing editor would rip them off of my typewriter. We had long rolls of paper that we wove into the typewriter, so he'd rip it off. I'd keep writing. A few graphs later, he'd rip it off again. Now, you wouldn't have that today because you'd write your story and it would move very quickly. But at that time, the story had to be edited as it is today, but then it went to a linotype operator who retyped the story, and so it came out in hot metal. Now, we're talking about ancient history, but that added as well to the kind of excitement and charged atmosphere that was in the newsroom. We did not have, of course, social media at that time, and I didn't have it during my career in journalism. I didn't have it when I was a press secretary, and today I don't think I'd enjoy being a journalist or a press secretary as much because of the social media add different dimensions, and it's much more, for a reporter, there's a lot of instant kind of reporting that you do if you're a professional reporter, and you're tweeting, you're blogging, and I always appreciated the fact, even though we had deadlines, we had a couple every day. We didn't have a deadline every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes. So that gave me the opportunity to go more in depth into stories and also to reflect on what the information I had before putting it out. That's a long answer, but it was a lot of aspects to that question.
Yes, that's true. And going on that same line of thought, most people, they got their news, they made a cup of coffee and they went out to their front doorstep and they picked up the print newspaper, and that was their primary source of news for the day. And now, like you mentioned, there's Twitter, there's Facebook, there's bloggers. It's the 24-hour news cycle of which you really, I think, as a citizen looking at this, really have a hard time discerning what is actual fact, how much fact-checking has gone on, the fundamentals of journalism as I think that they would have been taught in schools 20 years ago, accuracy. Has speed taken over? You mentioned, you wouldn't want to be a journalist or a press secretary, because it's every 5 minutes you have a deadline. And what is accurate, what isn't? What fundamentals of journalism have been lost in the shuffle with the social media? And how do you even combat that? As a reader even, trying to find out, did this individual, are they a citizen reporter? Are they an actual journalist? What is a journalist today? I mean, how do you define a journalist?
Well, I think it's very difficult to define a journalist, and right now in Washington, the Congress is considering legislation which would shield journalists from having to reveal their sources. But now you have the government into defining who is a journalist and who isn't. I think it's very difficult to tell. We certainly don't want to get into licensing journalists. And I think there are professional standards that I learned in a newsroom early on. You never 100% were unbiased in a story. Nobody is unbiased, but you tried to be fair. You tried to have all sides, and certainly the goal was to give your readers or viewers as accurate a picture of what was happening as you could. Now, you have a lot of people putting information out today in what looks like news or reporting, and they've got agendas, and they have not had the professional training, and they certainly don't have the professional discipline of trying as much as possible to take themselves out of a story, be fair to all sides. That's not what it's about for a lot of individuals who are putting information out today. So now you have a public which has access to more information than people ever had before. And you've identified a significant problem here, and that is, how do you determine what's accurate and what isn't? And the best advice I can give on that count is go back to the traditional sources. Now they're online, but like newspapers, because the people who are providing the content there are trying to live up to professional standards. Now, some people can argue, well, they're one way, they're too liberal, or they're too conservative, but there are parameters there. And what I try to do is look at as many sources as I can, and I stick mainly to the traditional ones. And then that helps me reconcile where things stand on a particular issue or a particular development.
And I think citizens who really care about the issues, whether it be, on the political party side, where I think a lot of what you said is, they're framing their own argument for their own benefit. It's not necessarily looking at a public policy issue on both sides of it as trying to get their side of it out, which other side you look on. And also, too, I saw something that really, I think a lot of people are looking at NPR as a legitimate news source. Not that it always wasn't, but really that people are gravitating more towards that than print media, only because of the number of foreign correspondents that they have now, and really people, I think, genuinely feel that NPR, National Public Radio, of course, is what I'm speaking about, has a better field of journalists that do look at both sides of the story, which I thought was interesting. And I think, that, talking about print media, I think there was a real opportunity loss there when the internet really started to come up. And I would imagine it would be very difficult for newspapers to overcome that now when you're just in this huge cycle of social media and the fast news cycle where, I think the traditional print media, while it would still be looked at as the standard for journalism, it's kind of gotten lost in the shuffle, which I think is unfortunate. But I'd like to touch on, you said, when you worked for former Governor Edgar, back then, you had just finished up at the Sun-Times.
Right.
And I know that the decision to go with the secretary at the time was a well thought out one. And originally, I think he had approached you previously, and you weren't exactly done with, investigative reporting yet. So if you could kind of talk about that, and I know many in the industry would look at that as going to the dark side, leaving journalism to go work for an actual elected official. I know it was a big decision.
Yeah, it was. I really thought I was going to be a reporter my entire adult life, and that at some point I'd be carted out of the newsroom, and go right into the embalming room. I really thought that that would be my entire career. And you're right. Then Secretary of State Edgar approached me in 1985, actually, about coming to work for him. I wasn't ready, as you've said. I was not ready to leave journalism in 1985. In 1987, I decided that the Sun Times situation had not worked out exactly the way I thought it had when I made the move over to the Sun Times. And I called Secretary Edgar and said, if you're still interested, I think I am. And you're right, I had thought this through, but that's actually, it came about that I called him. And we talked, and it didn't take us long, maybe 2 or 3 days, to put together an agreement where I would come to work for him. He was gearing up to run for governor.
Right.
Governor Thompson was serving his 4th term, and even though there was some thought he might go for a 5th, I mean, as you well recall, people called him governor for life. But it was pretty clear that Edgar would more than likely be running for governor, and I'd gotten to know him through the years. I had a high opinion of him. I thought he was in public service for the right reasons, and so I made that move. Now, at the time, a lot of my colleagues in journalism were stunned. I don't think I'm overstating that.
No.
I remember right after I went to work for the secretary, there was a column in a newspaper, basically saying, this was a great loss to journalism, but also saying, Lawrence went for more money, or like a lot of journalists, he went for more money. Actually, my compensation package was less than I had at the Sun Times.
Right.
But I thought to myself, boy, I go to work for Edgar with the idea of helping the guy, and here he gets accused of trying to buy off an investigative reporter
Right.
who wouldn't be writing about him. And anyway, I made that move. It was a major move, and there was a gamble associated with it,
Certainly.
a big gamble. You were in high school at the time.
Yes.
Your grandparents had moved to Springfield to locate near us, and Edgar's going to be on the ballot in '90, running for governor
Right.
in what we figured would be a very tough race. And if he'd lost that race, I would have been out of work, at
Right.
least for a while.
Yes. Probably not very long, I wouldn't imagine. But, and it's interesting, I think, talking about that aspect of it, because I do recall that well, of course, being that age, really a lot of high schoolers think, oh, it's all about me, and all of that, that kind of a self-centered attitude. But it was really interesting because it was very exciting, and I know that you and Jim Edgar have a really very close relationship. You have a lot of the same thought processes in terms of, the right and wrong things to do in terms of public policy and, what the betterment of the state of Illinois, whether you be reporting on public policy issues or you actively be seeking them yourself. I think it would be an interesting conversation to have about going from being the investigative reporter and reporting on certain things that possibly Secretary Edgar or other elected officials would be doing back then at the time, to going to dealing with journalists on the other side. So, whether it be through the gubernatorial campaign or after he was governor, and any kind of major public policy initiative where you would have, you would likely, of course, because you did this, know what questions to anticipate as press secretary, and probably better know how to deflect how a story could be written based on your responses to the media, of which you came. So I think I would be interested to hear how that aspect was. And to add to that, was it ever challenging or frustrating, depending on who the reporter was asking the questions, if you didn't feel that their questions were appropriately being asked?
Well, one of the things I had to learn, and it took me a little while, it was not to be judgmental about the reporters, where I was, saying, why are they doing it this way or why are they doing it that way based on how I would have done it.
Right.
But the main difference was, as a journalist, you were out to find what was going on, to dig in sometimes to activities that could be improper or inappropriate, but also I also tried to write in depth on policy issues. And the idea was you'd do your research and then you'd share it with the public, whatever you found out. Well, as a press secretary, uh, Jim Edgar and I had an agreement going in that I would not lie. And I said to him, if I thought you'd ask me to lie for you, I wouldn't be going to work for you. But just so you know, if you do, I'm not going to lie.
Right.
But, so I would answer the questions of journalists, but there were things I knew more about. I wasn't,
Sure.
my job was not to tell them everything I knew about a particular subject they were inquiring, and I really did not lie. I did not mislead, and I think journalists who were covering us at that time, they might have issues with me, but I think they would say that I did not lie and did not mislead. And I thought that was important, not only for my reputation and credibility, but also for Jim Edgar's. But that was difficult, to know things and not necessarily talk about them. Another aspect, of course, of the arrangement I had with Jim Edgar was that I would be in the room when the major decisions were made, and I would have my say. And as you indicated, Jim Edgar and I were on the same page on a lot, I would say 95%, 96% of the policy questions. There were about 3 or 4% where we weren't. And I'd be very blunt with him. He'd be blunt back. There were times, there were conversations when other staff people were almost shaking at the intensity of the conversation between Jim Edgar and me. But the fact of the matter is, he appreciated that feedback, if not at the moment.
Right.
He did appreciate it, and I felt comfortable after I'd have my say in speaking for him, because I felt he deserved to have his opinion covered, whether I privately agreed with it or not. Overall, I felt he was trying to do a good job, and we're kind of seeping into the governorship here. But even as a candidate, trying to do what was right. And so if we did have some differences, they were minimal compared to the working relationship and the basic fundamental agreement that you alluded to about what government should do, should not do, and what a public servant should do and should not do.
And to kind of continue on that point, I think it's critical and crucial that elected officials have that no person. When you have a bunch of yes people around you, you really, I think, maybe get clouded in your judgment because you don't have all the information and don't have all the facts. So how important is it to have an individual, regardless of how painful the experience may be, to have someone say, no, this is really, you've got to look at this from all angles, and I know you would like to see this end result, but here's why it can or can't happen, and here's how we have to get there.
Well, I think it's vital. And first of all, that public official has to want people like that around him. And not all public officials do. The instinct of the public official is, I've got a great idea, I want to move forward on it, and if they're talking to the senior staff and you have one or two in the senior staff say, we don't think that's such a good idea, and here's why. The typical human reaction will be for the public official to get defensive about it and to say, hey, I'm the governor, or I'm the senator, or I'm the congressman, and I'm going forward with it. But by having people around who will raise these issues, it will at the very least, get in front of the public official the downsides of the policy or the action that he or she wants to take. So again, you have to have the public official really sets that culture. He or she has to be open to that to begin with. And I've known public officials in my life who were not open, and a couple of them got themselves in real trouble. And from the staff standpoint, there are a lot of people who work for public officials who are afraid to confront the public official because, among other things, they might get yelled at. Well, I learned a long time ago in a newsroom that getting yelled at wasn't fatal. So, I did not mind if somebody got uptight with me, but the other thing is, some staff people believe if they raise questions about what the public official is going to do, they won't get invited to the next meeting. And to a lot of people in government and politics, as you know, they want, in part for ego purposes, frankly, they want to be in on those high-level meetings, so if nothing else, they can tell people they were in the meeting. So it's a very important aspect of running a government, for example, or running a governmental office. And I don't think that can be overemphasized.
I would tend to agree, and I think there are elected officials who don't want to hear any kind of bad news. They don't want to hear that their possible idea won't work. Going on that, moving forward, and kind of keeping in the theme of journalism, after Edgar had announced that he wasn't going to run again, and you went and joined former U.S. Senator Paul Simon with his institute down in Carbondale, Illinois, at SIU, Southern Illinois University, of course. And then, taught journalism and some other classes that I think it would be interesting to hear on how, coming from where you did, from starting with the Lawrence Weekly with the carbon paper, to teaching the fundamentals of journalism and how to be a good journalist and the right things to do in this day and age of social media, where really, I recall you telling me a story that you had a senior who turned in a paper who didn't capitalize her I's.
Yeah.
And it was just, there's that different aspect. Is it because of texting? Is it because of, the vast amount of Facebook, Twitter, and all that? We're not setting a premium on really the English language as it should be traditionally taught. But who's to say, is that how it's supposed to be taught now? Can you explain how you brought in your experience and thought processes on how a journalist should write and what that definition is, and compared it to what the younger people of today, what's their idea of becoming a journalist, and how is it different? Or is it different?
One of the ironies of my teaching journalism was I never had a journalism class myself. I learned journalism in the newsroom of the Galesburg newspaper, where I worked summers, and 2 or 3 summers for nothing. It was, at the time, I don't think I knew the term internship, but what I was doing was actually an unpaid internship. That's why I learned it. But in teaching about it, I tried to convey the importance of maintaining principles as a journalist. One of the goals that a lot of people talk about was, well, be objective, be unbiased. Well, I don't think you any individual can be objective or unbiased. You bring your life's experiences and your views into any situation. But the discipline is to try as best as you can to take that out of what you're doing, even though knowing you can't take it totally out, and basically to be fair. Now, in dealing with well, let me say first of all, I had several outstanding journalism students. They're out there today. They're doing very well. I'm proud of them. But there were, students I had, and particularly I taught for 13 years, and towards the end of that period, I was detecting that there were issues coming into their writing, and you alluded to one where, for example, the word "you" was "you," the letter "U" in the copy. But there were other things too. The attention span was less. They weren't accustomed to writing any pieces that might be over 150 or 200 words. What's Twitter? About 140 characters max, something like that. Characters, not words. So, and the other thing, and this is an overarching problem, a lot of the journalism majors said they wanted to be writers, and they didn't read newspapers. They wanted to be newspaper writers, did not read newspapers. That's a fundamental problem. I learned to write, as I alluded to earlier, by reading newspapers. Now, that's not all there is to writing. The way I taught my courses, I had the students write. I gave them a lot of feedback on their writing. And to me, that's the most effective way to teach that. But the fact of the matter is that if they don't read what I'm going to call journalese, how news stories are put together or opinion pieces, they're at a real disadvantage in writing them. In fact, that's understating it. And I emphasize you have to read to write.
I would agree, and both you and Mom actually are fantastic writers. Different styles, but nonetheless fantastic. But I recall you saying, you really learned how to become a excellent writer by reading and newspapers, and you can really kind of see that, and whether you had been writing a column or in any aspect of it, that does come through, because there is I think a very important aspect of being able to write something about a complicated issue and make it so easily understood that the average person can relate to it, even if they've never heard of this public policy issue whatsoever. So I think that's a real talent. And I guess what I'm hearing here is that really, if you have basic fundamentals, you're seeking the truth, you're seeking to look at all aspects of an issue, whatever you might be reporting on, that really, I guess, we shouldn't be so overly concerned about the influx of the internet and social media if, in fact, whomever is writing it have the core basic fundamentals inside of them that makes them want to write, the best that they can, whether it be on Twitter or Facebook or, a blog or an actual print media or something along those lines. So that's, I think, a very critical point of it. And just to wrap it up, I want to thank you for doing this. This was a lot of fun, and hopefully, I know the students out there, you have mentioned several that are reporters today, and very good ones from what I understand. So that's certainly a testament to you, and once again, the Illinois Channel thanks you.
Well, I thank you. Usually we have these conversations over the dinner table. This is a new experience for both of us.
Yes.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.